Hey, what's going on, class? Hope you guys are doing well. It's late Wednesday night here in Seattle, and the primary source document for this week is this 87-page manuscript. It's basically a persuasive book by a guy named William Carey, who was a pastor at a Baptist church in England, former shoemaker, kind of regular guy who made this 87-page manuscript titled An Inquiry into the Obligation of Christians to Use Means for the Conversion of the Heathen, commonly referred to as an inquiry, but all about sending missionaries out. And this guy is fired up and he makes a great argument. So there are 5 sections to it. I'll just go through each of the 5 sections, summarize them as succinctly as I can. But he starts off in the introduction by quoting Romans 10, 13 through 50, saying that everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. But how can they call on him in whom they've not believed? And how can they believe in him who they've not heard? And how can they hear about him without a preacher? And how can someone preach to them unless someone is sent? So right off the bat, he kind of makes it pretty clear where he's going, that people need to be sent if people are going to be saved. And then he dives right in to saying that pretty much Christians, all Christians, are under an obligation to use every lawful method to spread the knowledge of Jesus. And I think one thing to note right at the beginning is just this desire. He connects the desire to see people saved with proof of being under God's grace and partaking in the Spirit. So he's really making a pretty good argument here, kind of saying, hey, if you don't agree with me, you might not be under God's grace. You might not really be partaking in the Spirit. And then what he does is he goes in and he gives a brief background on sin, leading up to Jesus and Jesus as the Messiah, before basically just saying that, hey, the current missionary efforts that are going on right now are lackluster at best. He pretty much just blasts all the missionary work that is being done, saying we are not doing enough, we can do better. He's even challenging them with things that are interesting, but really poking at people's hearts, pretty much saying, hey, if you don't share this missionary heart that I do, then probably one of 2 things is true. Number 1, you just don't understand how lost the world is. Or number 2, you probably just like your comfort more than you like saving lost souls. So he's really jabbing at people who might disagree with him. He's really setting it up strong. Section 1, right? 5 sections. Section 1, he goes straight into talking about the Great Commission. This is clearly in response to some of the beliefs that came about as a result of the Reformation, where the Great Commission was put on the apostolic age only, saying the apostles fulfilled this. This doesn't have any application for us. We don't really need to take this into consideration. And William Carey absolutely blasts and destroys this argument. I think he does a pretty good job. He says some cool things. When some of the things he says is just like, number 1, if the Great Commission isn't for us, then why are you guys still baptizing people? So he's kind of taking all of the Great Commission and be like, well, if this really isn't for us, why do we even try to do any of these things? Even saying that, well, if we are still trying to make disciples, then maybe we're actually going against the Bible. Could that be the case? Kind of this backdoor approach to making his argument. And my favorite part, which is where he says, well, maybe we shouldn't be, maybe we shouldn't be teaching people to obey either if the Great Commission isn't for us. And then, of course, linking it to the last part about, God being with us till the very end of the age and how these really are all connected. So he makes a pretty good argument. Section 2, he goes into the history of missions. And this part is long. He details the whole missionary movement in the book of Acts, like in detail. But then even goes beyond Acts and starts talking about the early church fathers, Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, moves on to Constantine, and then goes all the way up to his present time, which is 1792, so late 18th century, and pretty much says that, hey, things aren't going well. But one cool thing that he does note is that the Moravians, who we learned about last week, he says that they've done a better job than anyone else in regards to missionary work. So he definitely gives them a shout out. Section 3. Section 3 is pretty interesting. I mean, it blew me away. So he has these charts where he basically outlines every country in the known world minus like a few, the United States being one because it's, not very old at this time. But pretty much every country in the world breaks it down by size, like land size, population, even listing islands that have less than 1,000 people on it, and current religion. And he does all of this, and it's pretty significant, but he does all of this to kind of come to a conclusion, which is that, hey, there are about 731 million people in the world, 420 million of which he says are in, quote, pagan darkness. So, wow, what a statement, right? And then he also is like, hey, and those other 310 million who aren't in pagan darkness, they're not necessarily doing very well either. And this is pretty significant because he uses all this data and this reasoning, this statistical reasoning, to make his argument for why missionary work is so important, which seems to me to be, a definite repercussion of the Enlightenment and the age of reasoning, and just a new way of going about things, that while he is making spiritual arguments, he's definitely using a lot of just reasoning, statistical reasoning even. And then he's all of this, of course, to say that this is reason enough for us to take action. All right, section 4. Section 4 is kind of cool too. Like any good argument, one thing that Carey does is he foresees the coming objections and then just tackles them head on. He sees the first objection that people are going to come with, like, hey, this is going to be hard to go all over the world. But he's like, hey, terrible objection, because we're so good at navigating the globe now that we can sail anywhere. And it's kind of interesting too, because here he points out to like commercial fishermen and trade companies that these are the people who are actually really good at like navigating the world with boats. And I think that's kind of significant as well, because he ties Christian mission to business as like an effective way. It seems like it's kind of the first time in this manuscript where he does that, right? Talking about how commercial ships will be of great use to them. And then number 2, he talks about how, people who don't know Jesus are uncivilized, they're barbarians. That's why we don't want to go. And he basically is just like, hey, that's the worst excuse ever. We're Christians. Did you expect this to be easy? If you only go through with this, if it's easy, then you obviously don't love the lost very much. So again, he's making pretty strong arguments. But he's like, on top of that, the best way to bring civilization or to help these uncivilized people, which he doesn't really disagree that they're uncivilized, but he says the best way to help them is to bring them Christianity, to bring Christ to them. So we see a little bit of this colonialist mindset in it a little bit, but very much in like, hey, we want to go help these people. And with the kind of the cool thing too is that Carey also really lived this out. I think it was the year after he wrote this, he went to India and served as a missionary there for about 40 years until he died. So this man at least totally lived out his conviction. So respect to him. The next objection that he tackles is the danger of being killed. He's like, yeah, of course, that's an option. But hey, dying for your faith, not the worst thing in the world. And he's like, in the past, these heathens have been pretty willing to hear the word of Jesus. So Again, not a great objection, he says. Fourth, he talks about supplies, how missionaries will be supported. Kind of cool. He goes into some details about how, some practicals for how they can address this. Excuse me. But also just calls them back to radical discipleship, talking about the willingness to suffer, to let go of one's life. We see some like heroism in here, which is just discipleship too. But he's really hounding them like, hey, the only reason that you're not willing to go save the world is because you're just not willing to suffer enough. So make some pretty strong arguments. Let's see. He says some interesting things that married men should go. They should take their wives since they will be doing missionary work. Maybe some other couples should go along with them to help them out, to help provide for them. Then he talks about language barriers, saying that they might need to send translators with them. But section 5 is where it gets really interesting, because this is obviously the conclusion. He starts talking about how important prayer is. And that, with all the denominations out there, that prayer is really the one thing that everyone should be able to agree on and be unified in, right, is praying for mission. But then it seems like he's kind of using that to lead up to this statement, which is, he says, quote, "We must not be contented, however, with praying without exerting ourselves in the use of means for obtaining of those things we pray for." So basically he's saying, hey, we got to do more than just pray. And I think this is significant because, again, he's calling attention to the individual, right? That it's not just on God. We got to do something in this too. Kind of this mindset. And it's also interesting that right after this, so he talks about, hey, we need to do more than pray. And then he gives an example of people who go above and beyond. But it's interesting, he doesn't really use Christians, or he doesn't use the church, maybe I should say, as an example. But he uses like a trading company as an example of how they'll fulfill their charter, and then they'll go above and beyond because they just have this desire for success. And it's really interesting because he's almost saying, hey, if our missionary efforts looked a little bit more like these companies, like these businesses, like these trading companies, we might be a lot more successful than we would be if we keep doing it the way the church has done it in the past. So it's a total move away from tradition, from the church, and a move towards business and kind of the people who seem to be doing it the best at their day and age. And then he starts talking about, this is really right at the end of it. I did read all 87 pages. This thing was long, but it was really interesting. He talks about the creation of a Baptist mission society, one that would raise money from congregations all over the place and send out these missionaries. And this is so significant because, again, they're going totally aside of the church, right? They're saying, hey, the church has kind of failed with mission. So you know what we're going to do, just us regular Joes, we're going to organize and we're going to raise money and we're going to send out missionaries to save the world. So really it's this turn to the individual. They're saying, hey, we don't need tradition. We don't need the church. We have the scriptures. We're going to do something with this. And with that, kind of created this new age of missionary work that started at the end of the 18th century. So pretty fascinating stuff. Hope you guys were able to listen to this and not have to read all 87 pages, even though it was interesting. Appreciate you guys.